So, um, yeah, there's a couple interesting things from a few other textbooks that I do want to include this week. And uh, so these all have to do with like sociocultural contexts of trauma that involves more than an individual. And it is kind of appropriate that today's the anniversary of like 9/11. And so it really is, you know, a, an appropriate example of this. And so I had this professor, um, and his name was Dr. Becker. And he was like a social anthropologist, and he did one of the first studies of trauma in sociocultural contexts. And uh, so he went to a town, and the town had had a flood, and a lot of people died or were injured. A lot of people lost their homes or businesses. And he went there after the town had recovered, so years later, a few years later. And but he wanted to do, they have quantitative and qualitative studies. He did a qualitative study, which means you do these in-depth interviews with people surrounding whatever subject you want to research. And so he and his graduate students interviewed so many people in this town. And so the interesting thing is their change of time perspective communally based on a trauma that the entire town had experienced, this flood. And so when they would start telling about their lives, he wasn't even interviewing them about the flood yet, but he would ask them about their lives. And they would said, well, when I was still in school, that was before the flood. And then they'd continue on with the story. Or they might say, well, I got married, and that was after the flood had occurred. And both me and my wife had grown up in the town and experienced that. So what they used that traumatic event for was a timeline demarcation because it had made such an emotional impact on their lives and as a result on their life timeline. And so, you know, there are positives and negatives. So, in one sense, if you experience like a trauma like that, or it could be like 9/11, uh, you have other people to talk to about it, and that could help in the healing process. So you might have a group and a therapist, and you might all talk together in that group, and that might be helpful. But it could also be detrimental in like it could perpetuate the memory in a negative way, in not a therapeutic way. So it has pros and cons. But a couple things I do in therapy uh, that this reminds me of. And the first one is a life timeline of important events. And by important, impactful. And it could be either positively, so maybe the birth of a child or a wedding or whatever, graduation, whatever it might be, or it could be something negative that was uh, important impact. It could be divorce or the loss of a loved one or, something like that, or the loss of a job or the closing of a steel mill. Okay. Um, so like if I went to uh, visit my wife's family around California, PA, so she grew up in Denora, but the family would talk about life before the closing of the steel mills and after the closing. And it was considerably different, of course. Um, so, you know, this could happen with any community that experiences a trauma or a group of people that experiences something. Um, and I would say I wouldn't worry too much about the numbers. It could be a small group of people. It could be a large group of people. Um, but I think it needs to be taken into consideration. Um, so this is kind of like the first part of the social context when we talk about crisis and trauma in social contexts. And even I don't know of any, I've tried to look, but I don't know of any studies that have been done like on 9/11 and people who experience trauma as a result of that, uh, and the way it was processed or treated um, in larger groups. Like I've read a lot about how individuals have healed from that, but not a lot about kind of like a larger social context. Um, Now I know like New York City has done some things socially, uh, like remembrances, memorials, things like that. I know they've done some things with the flight that crashed in Somerset, and they have a memorial there, and each year they have a community remembrance. Um, the I think that if we think about it culturally, you know, I think that um, one of the things is whether an individual belongs to an individual culture or a collective culture. And um, so an individual uh, is kind of focuses on the success and welfare of one person or immediate family, whereas a collective culture, everybody focuses on the good of the community as a whole, and there's not as much individualism. In an individual culture, it's also a guilt-focused culture, whereas a collective culture would be a shame-based culture. So what do you think like the United States would be categorized as a whole? I know there's lots of cultures within the United States, but yeah, it's definitely individualistic. Yeah. And that's not to say there's not subcultures. What would a collective culture generalization be?
Asia.
Oh, Hmong, yeah, yeah. So yeah, somebody was going to say something on online.
I just said Asian cultures. They're all pretty much collectivist.
Exactly. So, and they said like, so the Hmong, I would say the Japanese culture, um, and so individual and guilt versus shame and collectivism, and of course like Native American culture, most uh, Native American cultures were more collective, and that shame or guilt influences how individuals process trauma as a community. Um, and I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong. I can tell you which one I would like better, but I just think part of this is that when we consider trauma, we also, especially like, um, you know, uh, in a cultural context. Um, I think it's important to consider the culture to which the individual belongs, because it does play a role in the healing process, how that trauma is addressed, you know, and so I think that um, one of the things that um, a lot of times counselors don't do is, we all take, uh, multicultural counseling, and hopefully the program will have multicultural infusion, which is how culture plays a role in whatever subject you're talking about. Like we're talking about trauma and bringing up culture. How does it play a role? Um, so, but a lot of times, you know, uh, I think the trend used to be, how do we better learn about cultures that differ from our own? But the new trend is to really think of culture and many other things as kind of a spectrum where, yes, there are large cultures, and we can, like we just said, okay, Asian. Well, that's, a large area um, and population, or maybe Japan, that's smaller, or maybe, but if we look inside each of those areas, there's a lot of different types of people and groups of people and subcultures. But I think the new trend uh, is more about the infinite possibilities in diversity and grouping of that diversity. And that kind of gives us a new perspective of culture and diversity. So let me give you an example. So, if I went um, and I became a therapist at maybe a home for elderly individuals, I would have to consider lots of things in diversity. I would have to consider age and ageisms. Um, I would have to consider, you know, uh, race and uh, gender and identity and disability and other health issues and just such a variety, you know. And that's why I like the concept of diversity. It includes so many, it includes socioeconomic status, you know. It includes uh, it, not only culture, but location and everything. So that would include like, what's the makeup in that location? What are the struggles? Um, so it just includes so much more. And that's why I like seeing kind of like this spectrum with infinite possibilities and infinite groupings. And so, it just kind of opens up everything and all of the different possibilities and considerations. So when we think about it that way, um, and I have a degree in just this, but one thing I found was that it's impossible. Even if I lived in a specific culture for an extended period of time, it's not like growing up in that culture. Um, and then there's all types of micro cultures, and it could include family and extended family, okay, and all of the different traditions that they might have that are different than another family's tradition. Um, so so what I ended up doing is, yeah, I learn as much as I can about cultures because I enjoy that. Um, I enjoy learning about people, but it's impossible for me to truly understand unless I'm a part of that culture. And so that's why one of the most important things in any counseling experience is the building of trust with a client. And um, you know, and by that, it's like I'm going to be genuine. I'm going to be uh, non-judgmental and unconditionally accepting and kind of all those person-centered traits that a good counselor has. I'm going to be empathic and I'm going to be open to learn and you know, and I think that as the professional counseling relationship deepens, you know, I think we learn about each other and we both experience change as a result of that therapeutic relationship. I mean, I know I've grown just as much as my clients have grown from the counseling experience. Um, because we're all human beings, you know. But so I would place that, you know, as you know, pretty high up in importance when talking with anybody about trauma. Because not only do we have to build that trust for culture and diversity, but anybody who's experienced trauma has to have a foundation of trust in a therapeutic relationship uh, because that trust has most likely been damaged in some way. So, I think that's an important part of this, and we have a whole class on this, um, but I think that's kind of a unique perspective that maybe you might not get in the average multicultural counseling class. Um, so, uh, let's see what else. So the technical term for what I'm, basically expressing is cultural humility, basically. Um, let's see. Another concept, move changing the subject a little bit, when individuals deal with um, difficult subjects and or subjects where the therapist may not be comfortable. The client might experience counselor withdrawal. So, what happens is if a subject comes up and the counselor isn't comfortable with that subject, the counselor might change the subject or uh, discuss it briefly, but not go into depth. And maybe that's a subject that needs to be addressed. And so the client understands what's happening. They understand that the counselor has withdrawn because of discomfort with the subject, whatever it might be. And then they're not going to share as readily. So it's a very subtle interaction that occurs. And no, it's usually not spoken about, you know. Um, but for example, I might have a client that has experienced something I have not encountered. And the first thing I'm going to do is share that with them that, well, um, I don't have a lot of experience with that, but uh, I'd like to, gain some more knowledge on that. I'm going to be with you in this process, and, I'm going to do the best that I can to help you through this journey, and and then we're going to work on it. And I'll get more supervision and I'll read more or whatever it needs to take. But I'm not going to withdraw. I'm going to be honest about it. And, you know, I think that, uh, so I'll give you a personal example. Like, for many years, I dealt with kids who had experienced abuse. And, And then one time, my supervisor said, "Oh, well, we have a new client. Could you take them?" Um, they were mandated to come because of crimes related to pedophilia. And I had, kind of an emotional reaction with my supervisor because for years I was treating victims, you know, and I had a good supervisor. She said that, she would be happy to let me refer or not take the client, not refer, but not take the client, or she would give me extra supervision. And so I took her up on that. And but that's just kind of one example, you know, and of a population that I had never treated before. I might not have felt comfortable with that. And you know, um, but it worked out okay, therapeutically. And I learned a lot. And it was definitely a growth experience as a therapist for me and my understanding. Um, I think that, and there is a chapter on this in the book, but I think while we're talking about kind of withdrawal and discomfort, you know, I think that um, burnout, you know, is a serious concern when counselors decide to enter into the field, the specific field of, treating trauma. And, you know, I think that everybody who wants to help people sees it as a very positive thing, and it is. But I think that a lot of new therapists don't understand what 8 hours a day, every day of the week, sharing stories of trauma is actually like. And that can be very difficult as a therapist. Um, and so, you know, when we think about self-care, it's more than just, you know, doing things that are relaxing for ourselves. Uh, it's more like getting appropriate supervision and counseling for ourselves. I think so many people think about self-care as like, oh, I'm going to do something I enjoy. I'm going to take a walk in nature, hang out with my dog, whatever it might be. But in this case, it's a lot more than that. We have to have self-care emotionally and psychologically for ourselves. And it's more than just something that gets our mind off the day. Because if we really care about our clients, if we have true empathy for our clients, you know, this is not an easy thing for therapists to embark on and to do for extended periods of time. Um, I can remember when there's another professor, he retired, his name was Jeff Samid, and we had worked together almost 20 years. And we had also worked together quite a long time with children and youth. And before he left, we sat in our office for an entire day and shared the stories that had impacted us most. And the reason wasn't just to hear each other's stories. It was because we rarely shared these stories. Like they were too traumatic to share with a regular class. Um, and we did that because it was therapeutic for us. And it was almost like, a critical incident debriefing. And, you know, I think it's something like well, you're retiring. We should probably do this, you know, before you go. Um, but yeah, I think we probably should have been doing that all along, because it was therapeutic. Um, but yeah, I think we will talk more about self-care, but I think it's more than what most students think self-care actually is, because this is a difficult subject, and it's going to be a specialty, especially. Um, all right, well, that's enough supplemental information for tonight. Questions, comments before we sign off? All right, we'll see you later.